EVs are coming, whether you like it or not. I'm here with Hitton Palmer and Winston Jordan, both experts in their field, and today we're talking about the electric car. So I'll let Hitton and Winston introduce themselves, but the electric car is I think, the premise for the discussion is it's not enough is known by the consumer, really, and we're not as behind as we probably think we are to a large degree, but there's still some road to travel. Let's start off with Hitton Palmer, and your business is Uwello. I always battle to pronounce it. What does Uwello do, and what are the things that people can look out for?
Thanks, George. Essentially representing the National Electric Mobility Program called Uwello. The name is Tosa, meaning to create, and that's what the activities have been on, is creating along the mandate of enabling, facilitating and mobilizing electric mobility introduction in South Africa. So a multi-stakeholder program working on both private sector, public sector and the broader innovation space to fast-track electric mobility in the country. On that context, it's established facilities around batteries, vehicle systems and the smart grid infrastructure, and also providing funding of localization and uptake of technologies to drive localization.
Lovely. That's a good drive to have, because I don't think there's enough of a drive. And then we have Winston Jordan, who's with Grid Cars, and it's
easier to pronounce.
It's a bit easier to pronounce. And been in the market for a number of years, and now focused on charging infrastructure. Give us like the 1-minute version of Grid Cars and Winston Jordan.
So Grid Cars, we've been in the market now for pretty much 11 years. So really driving around that. We did transition from the early days from looking at designing and building vehicles and vehicle technology and battery technology, and we moved probably 2012. We started getting much more into the software systems and how that technology would be to manage a good network and ensure that we follow the best practices worldwide, etc. And then from 2016 we became fully dedicated towards charging infrastructure only and left all the vehicle projects behind. They're not dead, they've moved into other hands. So I'm sure over the next few years you'll get to talk to the guys that are working with the projects and maybe see those vehicles get on the road eventually. But we're going to be focusing on building a world-class network of charging infrastructure and a world-class system that South Africa can ultimately plug into and other charging networks in South Africa can plug into.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a known fact that our charging infrastructure in South Africa actually exists. So tell us a little bit about what the expanse of that charging infrastructure looks like in South Africa, and put some car drivers or consumers' minds at ease that you can actually drive from here to Cape Town and not get stuck on the side of the road with a flat battery.
So we set out, and you're right, factually a lot of people don't know what is out there. But I think what's quite important is that they were right 7 months ago, but today they're wrong. So this has all happened.
Is it that quick?
It's happened that fast. So in the last 7 months, we've deployed, I'm going to say 52, but it's really still about 8 short of that. But those are in the process of going in now. But within the next couple of weeks, there'll be 52 units that have been installed across the country. Pretty much N1, N2, N3 and N4, there's no gap bigger than 200 kilometers on
200 kilometers.
On any of those roads.
An average range of an EV in South Africa today?
So I think we could call the average above 200. The older cars would be closer to 100, but the second generation of cars that came out from BMW, for example, they were already up at 200, and all the cars coming out now, whether it be BMW, Jaguar, Audi, all of them are up at 300 already, 400 kilometers. So
which means that there's no reason why you should get stuck.
Absolutely. And then on the more common roads like the N2, we've got 100 kilometer gaps, so it's a lot easier there. And that was really just done to make it accessible to the older cars. And we will endeavor to work with maybe not ourselves as investors, but with other investors or other network developers, anybody wanting to evolve networks, to strategically fill those gaps, that we start looking and saying, this is where the big gaps are. So I can tell you there's a 200 kilometer gap between Laingsburg and Beaufort West. So, if somebody's looking to install a charging infrastructure in that portion, in Peru, there's a great opportunity. Find a halfway in there, get a charge point down. That's going to immediately give people choices, and that's really what it's about now. It's about evolving that network further, that we give people a choice, that they don't have to charge at every point. Right now, if you're driving that road, you have to charge in Beaufort, you have to charge in Lanesburg. But if you put one in the middle, then you'll have a choice. You'll look and say, well, we can skip the Beaufort one, go to the one in the middle, which might be Hangover, I'm not sure where they are. But and from there we can look at then going all the way to Cape Town.
So Hitten shared a very interesting website with us yesterday and the day before called plugshare.com, right? And plugshare.com kind of shows you where all the charging points are. Your charging points, no doubt, is represented on plugshare.com.
So Plugshare is and it's very important to note, Plugshare is a user-driven website. So what happens is it's the users add the charge stations, not the manufacturers or the people that are working with them. So part of the problem is that a lot of the charging stations in Plugshare are wrong. They just simply don't exist. And they don't exist because somebody has seen an advert where somebody said, we're going to put 3 charging stations over here, and they quickly went and captured them on Plugshare. So there's a vetting process that's still missing to some extent. We have our own mapping systems that can show you where the charging stations are. The biggest difference is ours is live. So if a charge point is not physically online, it's going to show there's a problem with that charge point.
Is that so your grid and outside of your grid?
That's our grid, and to the best of our ability outside of our grid. And I say that because we can only include charge points that are connecting to the network. So when somebody starts charging, we can flag it as there's somebody charging here. So
and where do people go and have a look at that?
So the easiest place to find that would just be to go to evcharging.co.za.
evcharging.co.za. Okay, interesting. Second question is around batteries, because I mean you spoke about the first generation cars and doing 100 kilometers, and now cars doing more than 200 kilometers, even north of 300 kilometers. Hitten, this one's for you, and your organization kind of helps to support and fund the development of batteries. And I believe that a lot of work is being done in the Cape area around batteries. And until recently, I didn't know that. Tell us about the battery infrastructure, or should I say, manufacture that's going on, or testing.
Thanks, George. So I think latching on to what the earlier discussion is, challenging this whole range anxiety story, is looking at the technology progress of the EV side. Battery technology has improved on the vehicle. It's gone bigger and better. Secondly, charging infrastructure as well. The capacity to be able to charge a lot faster, a lot quicker. So the whole thing of range anxiety and how fast you can charge your car is actually really improved. So the vehicles themselves you can drive a lot further on. Technology is improved on that. And also on the infrastructure side, you can charge a lot quicker now. In terms of the technologies that are being deployed, so on that context. So if we look at battery technology, I think, one classic example in terms of South Africa, the i3, the first generation i3 came in with a 60 amp hour battery. That was in 2015. Today you can...
It's your kind of 100 kilometer sort of range.
In the region of 150 plus
150,
minus, yeah.
Okay.
Today you can go and buy the i3 in South Africa at 120 amp hour battery. So that's
double.
Yes, and that's what we see, is the rate of change of technology is really changing, and then you're also improving. That is directly impacting in terms of your range delivery from the vehicle itself, and then also on the charging side, matched hand in hand in terms of that.
So if we pause there for a second, I mean, I think a lot of people's misunderstanding, or should I say, a lack of detail is around, I mean, we understand a lot about 93 octane, 95 octane, and, range in terms of liters per 100 kilometers, all that stuff. But I don't think people are really up to speed around kilowatt hours, output. Before we get into the Cape Town story, tell us a little bit about the buzzwords and what they mean.
Yeah, again, it's about having to relate, and it's a mind shift as well, a paradigm shift that people need to change. Traditional mindset of kilometers versus liters and that sort of thing, and moving away towards that. And be able to do that. But that's really it. I mean, it boils down to your range in terms of your battery, and most of the stats on the vehicles always give you to say, okay, it might have a technical term to it, whether amp hours or kilowatt hours in terms of the batteries, but they've also got a range estimation. it's always a challenge to challenge the OEMs against the advertised range versus the actual, the same.
Well, we've got the same problem with 0 to 100 kilometers an hour and fuel range in the current ICE vehicles, right? So
I guess it's always about the driver, eh?
Exactly.
Yeah, but certainly within that context, you've always got that. Same like your fuel consumption, you find certain EVs are electron guzzlers in terms of that. In the same context, in your traditional ICE engines in that same context. So I think that's the way to do it. But if I just follow on to the earlier question in terms of the advancements in South Africa, so I think certainly there's a lot of activity in terms of infrastructure rollout and around the whole space. I think the last week we also see news from the OEMs saying that there's a lot more interest in terms of local supply as well as local manufacturing in terms of EVs. But in the context of South Africa, certainly there's this Energy Storage Innovation Lab in Cape Town that's got the pilot facility already manufacturing cells, lithium-ion cells in South Africa, and already providing supply into certain markets. And we see that as well, that as we see funding and demand growing, we will upscale that into manufacturing. And from the investment side, certainly we have certain investments. Way back when in 2014, grassroots investment into grid cars as well from Uyilo, although Donson doesn't speak much about it. But certainly that's really it is, you know. I mean, in the early days, that's where it is. Last year, grid cars had the success of being bought out by Alviva Group. You know, so when we look at that, that's where grassroots investments drive certain investments into the country, into pioneers in this space to grow and really provide the service into the industry. And that's the value add from it, because again, we need to do all of these investments and drive the broader awareness and uptake of electric vehicles in the country.
So what I'm getting out of this is there is an infrastructure, grid infrastructure in South Africa. It exists. There is a drive to locally manufacture, parts, or should I say batteries and parts of cars that exist inside the EVs. And I know from our conference the other day, there is a drive to get us to 60% of the car being locally manufactured. So and that seems to be extending to the EV itself as well. So back to you, Winston. What in terms of the difficulty or technical nature of setting up these charging stations, because one thing that I think people get anxious about as well is these different OEMs have different plugs, and cars get charged at different rates. Talk us through a little bit about the different plugs, the different charging rates, how fast an EV charges, how slow an EV charges, and where we can find the different charge points at different speeds. I mean, do you sit at a coffee shop for 3 hours waiting for your EV to charge?
So yeah, there have been a lot of challenges. I want to touch on one quick one, and that is when we talk about the equivalent of what you used to 10 kilometers per liter and things like that. So the big thing with electric vehicles is really kilowatt hours. Some of the guys talk about amp hours. Problem is it's a technical term, and you've got to have additional maths to get to the real numbers. The real number is kilowatt hours. So the battery size in kilowatt hours is like the petrol tank size. So it tells you how big it is. And you're just going to get
kilowatt hours versus liters.
There we go. And the kilowatt hours is, the small BMWs were 20, the bigger ones are 30, the big ones now are 40, the Jaguar I-Pace is 90. So it just gives you an idea.
So that's like a 60-litre tank versus a 120-litre tank, and you're going to get your range out of the kilowatt hours.
Yeah. Okay. So to the challenges that we faced with the installations, I think at first we were probably quite brave, not necessarily stupid, but when we went into it, we felt, this is how we'll handle it. We identified a few high-level problems, so that's how we'll deal with that problem. Once we got tacky on the road and started doing stuff, we burnt our fingers a few times. We had a couple of challenges we had to manage carefully. But at the end of the day, the biggest challenges, if I step back and look at it, the biggest challenges we face is energy availability at a site. So firstly, some sites...
So what is energy availability on site? Is it Eskom delivering power?
The size of the cable coming from the municipality to the site. And it's not Eskom. In this case, it's just the physical infrastructure, the size of the pipe that we're pushing that energy through. Okay. And if we want more energy at the site, we've got to put a bigger pipe in. And that pipe often runs under the road and goes to a substation half a kilometer away. And to replace that pipe might cost you R1 million. And now you're trying to do an installation for 50,000 Rand, it costs you R1 million just to replace the connection to the pipe. So that's quite a critical thing. In some sites, we didn't actually have enough. But it was the only site in town, in the smaller towns, and no site in town had the amount of energy we needed, but the one site we chose only had 30 kilowatts available instead of 60. So we then run in a constrained mode at 30 kilowatts, and that,
Is that 30 kilowatts an hour?
That's 30 kilowatts in an hour.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. So 30 kilowatts level in 1 hour, 30 kilowatt hours.
And is that using the maximum capacity of that site?
It's using all the capacity of that site,
Okay.
what's left of the capacity. So, and we are, in other sites, even when we've managed to get 60 or 80 kilowatts, we've pretty much taken the last big 60 to 80 kilowatt chunk. So you're not going to put a second charge point down. And that becomes the next challenge, is to look and say, how do we start expanding this network? If we've got a lot of cars, we don't cars standing in line. The sites are going to be limited to putting more than one at a site, unless we really find ways of enhancing the power at that site. And one of those ways is to enhance it through solar. So to look at renewable energy, put up solar. The other way is to start strategically working with the cities to say, identify hotspots in your city where we can put bigger capacity. And let's start putting bigger infrastructure in from the city's infrastructure perspective, so that we know we've got it in that area and we can then easily install and expand those charging stations.
Okay, so I suppose that's one kind of like fast charging versus slow charging hurdle to get over is the actual amount of power or kilowatt hours available at the particular site. So in order to charge an EV from 0 to full, let's take the new BMW i3 as an example, what sort of capacity would you need to charge that car fully in an hour?
So all of the newer cars, so BMW, Jaguar, Audi, are all doing 100 kilowatt capable. So the biggest chargers we currently installing is 80 kilowatts. So you know, we can still step up a little bit further with that, but again, no availability, so no point in going too far yet to see where that's going to come.
So what I'm hearing is that the cars are slightly ahead of the charging capacities.
Yeah, I think that Porsche's bringing out cars that are going to do 350 kilowatts. And again, you know, there'll be extremely few places, like the biggest shopping malls, maybe, where you'll have 350 spare kilowatts to be able to charge those cars at one charger. If you want two of them, you need 700 kilowatts. You know, so that's what the challenge is. And the ability or the time it takes to charge a car is very dependent on, firstly, the size of the battery in the car. Secondly, the ability for that battery to absorb energy. So the older BMWs would have only absorbed 50 kilowatt hours maximum. So even if you had a 100 kilowatt charger, it only uses 50. And then, of course, how full the car is, etc. So it ranges anything from 15 to 20 minutes right up to 1.5 to 2 hours, even on that's using always a fast charger, but across the range of cars.
And then, Hitson, I mean, you touched on this particular topic yesterday and today, and that is the change of mindset of the consumer based on that particular challenge. Because what we're used to doing is we're used to arriving at a filling station, spending 10 minutes, 12 minutes, filling up your car and then driving on. I mean, those days are probably going to come to an end where, you know, you pitch up, charge your car and move on within 15 minutes. So how is the potential mindset need to shift, and how does businesses need to shift, particularly the filling station networks?
Yeah, certainly. So we must understand, again, as you mentioned around that, is the shift from traditional ways of using mobility and vehicles themselves to what the future or the current is presenting. Electric vehicles provide opportunistic charging. And let's start at the basics at home. And that's typically where we see international markets, 60% of charging actually takes place at home. So typically while you're sleeping overnight, the EV is charged. It's using a low rate of charging, typical to the household application, and also the grid is on less intensity then. Again, it's a cheaper rate to charge as well. So again, from an affordability perspective, you can then charge at home, and that's
so there's one change in behaviour, because we don't have fuel tanks at home, but now we do.
So same like your mobile phone, the minute you wake up every morning, your car is fully charged, ready to go. So the question is, even with the traditional EVs that came in at about between 100 and 200 kilometers, do you really need 200 kilometers to get your day through? Not actually. And even looking at the majority of people, 60% plus, 70% plus, get to work, the car is lying idle, right? You plug in, you connect again. When you leave at home, leave from work as well to get home, you fully charge and ready to go again. You top up again in the evening. Certainly within the case of South Africa, we've got the challenges within our large road network, and that's where the Powerway and the other activities in that sense contribute towards that. And that's where the change comes in from that perspective. But also latching on to the earlier discussion where we're seeing sites in South Africa have a challenge of supply, energy supply. We need to also embrace the technology that's available. So we look at, Winston mentioned about solar inclusion, but also storage, on-site storage. You're seeing some of the international suppliers supplying fast charging stations that have got built-in storage. So how that system works is when an EV is not being charged, it draws power from the grid and charges the battery. And when there's a vehicle being charged, then at the time you can actually deliver 100% capacity. So the challenges of being able to derate the charger just because of capacity is also questioned in that sense. There is technology available in that context. And what we've also demonstrated on the bigger ecosystem side is a holistic and resilient system for Africa and South Africa in being able to deliver 100% charging at any time, whether the grid is down, whether the grid is constrained, or whatever time itself, through inclusion of technologies of solar, batteries, in terms of even inclusion of second life batteries, repurposed from old age EVs, building that resilience and structure side. So, I mean, we must say that there is technology available to solve that. Obviously, the cost factor is always consideration, but we need to look at it in that context. How do we build and partner together with different concepts and provide the best solution as well as cost-effective solution at the end of the day?
I guess South Africa is perfectly placed for solar energy and battery storage. I mean, if you go to the middle of the Karoo, the sun's shining most of the time.
I had an interesting meeting this week down in Cape Town with an unnamed fuel supplier, and we were discussing a particular site, and they said, look, there's enough energy at the site, you'll be able to charge at 60 kilowatts, it's pretty much what's left at the site, but they are going to do a revamp of the site over the next 6 months, and they showed me the plans for the new revamp, and in the discussion, because they had 2 or 3 people in the meeting, they said, right, so this is where the charging stations are going to go, but we've already requested an upgrade from the city, so that we'll be able to do at least 3 charging stations at the site eventually. So we've already planned that. And then they said, this area over here, there's a whole bunch of trees, but they bought that property just next to the thing. And there's a little river running through, a little stream running there. They're going to turn it into a fountain and make it a place where kids can play and have little gazebos. And they said that people, because they realize now, people are going to need to start spending an hour or so at that site. And they're looking to how do we enhance that and drive it. And that to me is what the filling stations need to start realizing. They're not going to go out of business. They're just going to transform and do something differently. I spoke earlier in the week to filling stations. And the guy said, oh, but you can't expect us to change. And I showed him a picture of a filling station 20 years ago. And then I showed him a picture of a big ultra city today. And I said, really? You haven't changed over the last 20 years? So where do you think you're going to be going in the next 20 years? Just think, your changes now are going to be to accommodate people better, not to accommodate more and more cars.
Well, I mean, I suppose the filling station, if we're talking about filling stations per se, they're going to have to accommodate people for a longer period of time if the charging stations are there. But also, I mean, it doesn't sound to me like that pipe coming into the charging point or whatever the case may be is necessarily where the problem lies. The problem lies in alternative energy sources and then storing energy on site in the low times, so low demand times, so that by the time the peak time comes, you're not drawing on demand energy from the grid. You're actually drawing from stored energy, from solar.
No, absolutely, and I think we've modeled the storage side of it as well and looked at how we can handle those things. The challenge is the minute you add storage, as Hitton alluded to, the business model just flies out of the window because you put in a huge amount of cost that you also have to recover off of what you're selling. And the other challenge is that with storage, you would typically need to be having a time for the battery to fill. So that means the charge point is really only usable 50% of the time, assuming that 50% of your power is coming from battery.
Well, hopefully that happens between 12 and 5 in the morning.
Yeah, except first charge empties it, unless you're going to put a bigger battery in.
Exactly, unless you've got multiple batteries and solar and all those things.
So the models become very difficult. You really need numbers for those solutions to be viable solutions. So right now, the most viable solution is a network upgrade. In which get enough things going, the most cost-effective solution.
So, I mean, I suppose one of the other questions is if there's infrastructure and a charging grid and, people just don't know about it, that's part of the problem. So, we've got to tell them. We're starting to manufacture, or should I say test and play around with whether we can manufacture our own batteries. I mean, you said that we're even starting to push that out to some of the markets, at a small scale to see what that's about, and almost like a MVP type process. So if all of that's there, then the problem is, where are the cars?
Very good question.
So interesting enough, I was fortunate to attend the Nordic Eb Summit in Norway earlier in March. Obviously, Norway is the world leader in terms of electric vehicle deployment, and just in March, Oslo had 76% new car sales were EVs. That's the ideal scenario we want to have. And on the panel there was all the leading OEMs, and they said, guys, what is the real story here? And then they alluded to a statement of an investigation where they went quite a bit in Europe and a few countries. And there was, in Europe, I mean, in that context, there was the shortest lead time was 2 months in terms of waiting for an EV, up to 18 months in
After
Europe.
order.
Yeah. So you, as a customer on the street, you're going want an EV, that's when it's displayed on the floor, but waiting period. And then they unpacked it further and said, guys, what is the real story? You are the OEMs, what's the challenge? And it came down to battery production. And that's where it is. Globally, the scramble for EVs and just to get the whole transition right is around battery production. That's where, from the global suppliers, they said the bottleneck is. In terms of South Africa, so we're seeing that development happening globally. In South Africa's context, we must understand that the automotive industry is, in essence, a crown jewel of South Africa. 7% contribution to national GDP, and 7 multinational OEMs investing into that. And the investment on that is based on the broader framework of the investment policy framework from South Africa. So over the years, that's driven a lot on the ICE framework, but we're seeing obviously on the technology side a shift happening. However, our policy framework hasn't been fast enough to adapt to that. I think the minister's statement on Thursday alluded to that they're looking towards that. The fund that's coming in now in terms of transformation fund and NAMSA's commitment and the OEM's commitment to going further is highlighting that. But this is the challenge we face today, is that part of that framework is saying that there's currently a disincentive for EVs from a pricing perspective to consumers for uptake of EVs. So in context, EVs specifically imported from the EU under the free trade agreement, EVs attract 25% customs and excise duty, whereas internal combustion engines attract 18%. So we're already seeing a 7% difference. And above that is also an ad valorem duty, which is a luxury tax that's imposed on top of that. So in the region about 40, plus minus 40% in terms of taxation in that framework. So that is a challenge, and I think we've been trying to address it, and I think government is starting to take heed of that. All of us within the industry and advocates, we just wish it would be a lot more faster, but it is being addressed, and let's hope we can all collaboratively work together. And I think the ear is there towards addressing that going on. I think that the announcements in the last week is also indicating a positive side. But certainly we all wish, especially for those advocates of the industry, that it would be a lot more faster. But I think let's hope that things will change. But that's the status quo as it is. And that's where when you look at the pricing affordability, which is also affecting the uptake of EVs in South Africa, is basically coming down to the price, because you can tell the story about the great experience of EV, exhilarating acceleration, ability to charge at home, anywhere else. And the end thing from the customer is saying, what's it going to cost me? And that's where the eyes go. So yes, certainly, those are the challenges we face. And I guess South Africa is not isolated to that. It's a challenge globally. International markets where the government has got the revenue to incentivize that. You look at big incentives of certain countries that are pushing that. That's just because government has got the affordability to do that. In South Africa, we don't, and we need to be aware of that. However, South Africa and the government and cities can also consider non-financial incentives to try and drive the uptake of that. So it's a financial, and it's also alluded to in the conference, to look at the non-financial incentives to drive that. And that's where we need to all work together on.
But, why a difference of 7%? Why not just drop the import tax by 7% immediately?
Off at 18%, so at least there's no disincentive, because we must remember in South Africa, the Green Transport Strategy highlights that the road transport in South Africa is accounting to 91.2%, primarily 91.2% of emissions in South Africa, primarily from the combustion of petrol and diesel.
So then there's an incentive to actually bring it below 18%.
There's a framework that drives that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got a tax problem in terms of bringing EVs into the country. So that's one way to get consumer demand satisfied and to then give life to the charging infrastructure. And Winston, you mentioned a few weeks ago to me that the number of charging points per EV is one of the highest in the world in South Africa, which then speaks to all of these tax issues being 25% to bring in an EV versus 18% for an ICE vehicle, and that's why that ratio is so high. I mean, speak to some of the EV to charging point ratios internationally versus locally.
So internationally, you see averages of around 20 to 25. So that's 25 vehicles per public charging station. And it's a metric that just gives you some idea of, let's just say, how available charging is for cars. In South Africa, that's more like 5 or 6 vehicles. So in fact, it might even be lower now when we look at the numbers. But
so we could quadruple the volume of cars in South Africa and
yes,
still be within international kind of ratios.
Absolutely.
How many cars on the roads today?
500, 600,
1,000?
Yeah, so looking at plug-in electric vehicles, so that takes in the full 100% battery electric vehicles, plus your plug-in electric vehicles, which also utilize the infrastructure. It's just over 1,000.
Just over 1,000. So we could go to 4,000 quite easily, immediately.
Yes, yeah, for sure. So I think so we've moved ahead with the charging infrastructure, and I think it's trying to take some of that debate away, because often when you talk to people about electric vehicles, but what if I want to? What if I want to go to Cape Town? I normally exactly. I normally follow it up by saying, well, how often do you go to Cape Town? But that said, we've seen people driving. I think we saw 4 long trips on the long weekend that we had a couple of weeks ago. So there was 4 trips of people, 3 down to Cape Town, 1 down to Durban, and of people actually driving along that infrastructure and testing it. So we can obviously see, because we can see the guys charging at each of the charging stations. There was something published on Facebook where there was an i3 charging in Kroonstad, and our base arrived and had to wait because wanted to use the fast charger. Luckily, the i3 charges fairly quickly because it's a much smaller battery. So he was only about 15-20 minutes he was done, and then the iPace started charging. I think the race was then on to see who could get to Bloem first.
Who won, iPace or i3?
I'm sure the iPace was there first. So we are seeing these dynamics in the market, and I think it's in a good space. We need to stop saying that infrastructure is a problem. Right now, the problem is we've got to find ways to get more vehicles into the country.
Exactly.
We've got to find ways to promote the EV side of things. And you and I had a discussion recently around just that disruption level of what's going to happen. And if we look at internationally, what they've done is they've taken, let's call it a normal disruptive curve, and they've softened the curve by incentivizing electric vehicles. Whereas what we're doing in South Africa, because we're not incentivizing, let's not say we're penalizing, but what we're doing is steepening the disruption curve, because the end game is the same for all of us.
Well, we're very much in the hands of Europe, Japan and China.
Absolutely.
If they have a drop-dead date of no more ICE vehicles, that curve just gets steeper.
That's it. And we will meet that. So therefore, the end game for all of us is always the same. That date doesn't change. What changes is the rate at which we achieve that. And a steep adoption rate, if we go through a massively steep adoption rate, what we're going to see here in South Africa is, firstly, the rest of the world would have gone through an adoption rate much earlier and much less steep. They might have 20 years to train people to build businesses and to innovate. We will have 4 years, and we can't train people, we can't innovate in that space. What we're going to end up doing is just importing overseas technology. So we're missing a massive trick in this country. And my fear is that we might already be passing that red zone.
That point of no return.
That point that we can't change the curve quick enough anymore.
And it doesn't center around infrastructure, it centers around incentivizing the actual bringing in of these vehicles.
But the driving of the technology, and progressively, actively driving it, not reactively. Really finding ways to stimulate it, stir the pot as such, as opposed to saying we're just waiting for it to evolve along. And I think there's... And I know Hinton might have a very different opinion, because I do come from the more the commercial side and him more the government program side. But I think there's a perception from government that we're going to do a study for this and a study for that, and that maybe we can control how this is going to happen, as opposed to realizing this isn't going to happen to us. We've got to understand the implication of that. We are not going to control the rate.
Well, we
We're
can't,
control
right?
our
Because
response to it.
we're not a car designer. We're a car assembler and a car importer. So therefore, we are totally at the behest of Europe, Japan, and China.
And I think we're missing that. We all the surveys, if I read these surveys when they come out, it's almost as though we're trying to understand this beast so that we can control it. And that's not what this is. We should be looking and saying, this is the beast. This is how we've got to ride with it. How we will ride. So surf the wave, not stop the wave.
Stop the wave, yeah. So I mean, I think it's encouraging that organisations like ULO are actually. It gives me comfort that government is doing something. Maybe not fast enough, but they're doing something. So I mean, that's been fascinating, gentlemen. It sounds to me like at the end of the day, there's no infrastructure problem. There's no lack of knowledge, technology, or ability in South Africa. The problem lies with actually getting these cars on the road. And that kind of centers around two things. Incentivizing, dropping the taxes, those are the two areas, and then building local manufacturing plants that actually assemble EVs, because that will drive even further adoption and maybe soften that adoption curve. Any final thoughts before we shut this off? I've thoroughly enjoyed that. Go for it, Hilton.
Certainly, I think you touched on it there, and there's a lot of local manufacturing and that sort of thing. Let's not forget the opportunity that presents. Look at what Tesla did, right? And this is the challenge of traditional OEMs. For them to retool, move away from ICE, it's a heavily invested value chain asset. For them to retool and job losses and all the other things that they claim around that, that's the transition, and that's where it's been slow. Tesla started off the ground EVs and accelerated. In the last few years, they're playing in markets and destroying markets where these multinationals with billions of euros have dominated. So in the broader framework, while we still have an auto-rich country and skill set in South Africa, we can also leapfrog that and also drive local manufacturing specifically for EV, not only in South Africa but Africa. So those are the opportunities around that. But again, in closing comments, excellent discussion. Thanks for facilitating that, George. And certainly, I think these sort of initiatives and what we've jointly realized is a lack of awareness out there. And the more we can have these conversations, the more people can have on that. But yes, certainly, let's look forward to a fully charged industry. Eh?
I fully agree. Thank you very much, Hitton. Any final words, Winston?
No, I think in closing for me, I think the most critical thing that is, I want to say the education of the public, of the businesses, of everybody around, and understanding that EVs are not just golf carts. They are serious production vehicles. This is the future of where the automotive industry is going. And the reason it's the future is not because, it's a new technology and it's something new we can adopt. These technologies are cheaper, they're more efficient, they are more reliable, they are lower in maintenance, they are lower in operational cost. In every possible way, they are better. When I bought an EV, I went from paying 4,000 Rand a month in petrol, which I used the equivalent of saying I take 4,000 Rand and set it alight every month, to taking 4,000 Rand and investing it into the capital cost of the vehicle that I was buying. So yes, the car was costing me more, but at the end of the day, it was costing me the same because of the amount of fuel that I was using. And I think what we're missing, or what we mustn't miss, is that one of the solutions to relieving poverty in Africa in particular is going to be moving to electric vehicles, because we're going to knock this huge chunk out of our fuel costs. Logistics companies will say 60 to 70% of the costs are fuel. Okay, so imagine if that 60% just dropped out and was gone. It's 60% more profit. Well, not 60% more profit. It's 60% profit of your 100% baseline.
Ability to invest.
So it's real money. And I think that the people have to realize that this is a newer, a better, it's better in every possible way. It's better for our health, it's better for our pockets, it's better for your feeling of, wow, look at that car go. Okay, and in every way, this technology is the right technology going forward. It's not just a cool thing or the next new thing. This is the next new thing.
Well, I think it's super cool. I mean, if you haven't experienced the 0 to 100 acceleration of an EV, go and get into one. So that's been fascinating. Thank you, Hitton from ULO. Thank you, Winston from Gridcast. EVs are coming, whether you like it or not. So thanks, guys.